I don't know how you're doing that, but you are, I guess.
It's real simple.
Okay.
All right.
God damn, what an old geezer. Shit, where's my wig?
This is Dr. John Mason Hart, an esteemed professor of Mexican history, and also an authority on anarchism. We're in month 4 of Occupy Wall Street, which I think to people who've been through the wars like you and I have is really quite surprising that it's been sustained for this long. One of the moving forces behind this, one of the ideologies that's often raised, is that of anarchy, and a lot of people in this movement identify themselves as anarchists. But what I think is clear, if you talk to them or if you read a lot of the stuff they've written, is their understanding of anarchy is, let's say, fairly modern to be charitable. So what I want to do is talk to you a little bit about the historical roots of this political ideology to give people an understanding of what it means and how it's applied. I think today the stereotype of anarchists are people who kind of dress funny, and they advocate political violence, and they don't really have a message. They want to get rid of all government, that kind of thing, which isn't all that different from, let's say, Ron Paul or some of the libertarians. So, first of all, you want to just talk about the historical basis for anarchy.
Yeah, I think, when you think in terms of long-range perspective, it is really quite a complex social movement and body of ideas. The outstanding exponent of anarchist values and perspectives today would probably be Noam Chomsky, in the Western world at least. And in the earlier 20th century, you had individuals like the young Mao Zedong, who was also an anarchist. The movement as a formalized body of thought and action really started at the very end of the 18th century and gained momentum during the course of the 19th century. But in terms of the mode of social organization that anarchism represents, you can go all the way back to prehistory and to the origins of hydraulic agriculture, in which previously nomadic people had to sit down and figure out how to organize or reorganize their time when they realized the benefits that could be had by controlling and preserving water. And so they moved from semi-nomadic to sedentary life, and they did it initially, I think, and this is anarchist theory that's generally accepted by anarchists, they did it with more gender equality than you see in the modern world or since the birth of capitalism. They would also, I think, argue from the beginning that it's the natural order of things, even though the peoples who came together and formed these cooperative ventures for the control of water and then to develop rules for urban or town village living and regional marketplaces might just as well have been authoritarian. So you had an interspersal in which at least anarchist ideals of cooperation and community thrived, even if they were a minority movement.
So it's more a social organizational structure than a political.
Yeah, and in those days, the formalized ideology had not been created.
So it organized society.
And that, it's a good point, because the articulation of anarchism becomes really evident as capitalism is changing the social order. And then people say, well, hey, we're losing these valued things called liberty and freedom of association and community values as we move toward individualism and greed.
So you're familiar with the Diggers, right?
Yeah.
In 17.
Yeah.
So that I've always kind of seen that as an anarchist movement. Would you identify?
I think so. Yeah, anarchist related. In my experience, I studied early modern Europe to gain the origins, a knowledge of the origins of the movement as it applied to the creation of the Mexican labor movement, which anarchists organized in the 19th century. And it started out with the conceptualizations of Fourier and Proudhon, who argued, first of all, they identified the enemy. The enemies were church doctrine, the state with its imposition of myriad laws, each of which restricts liberty. You might note, by the way, the average American has about 1,200,000 laws that apply to their behavior. 30 years ago, I was visiting Dodger Stadium in Los Angeles, and it said by virtue of county ordinance 262,000 something or other C, with the letter C after it, that no drinking was allowed in the grandstand. I'm sure they've changed that law by now. There's so much money in drinking, but I thought to myself, my God, that doesn't count the city, the state, or the federal government. So they identified the church and the state and capital as the sources of freedom and of equality. As a young student, I remember reading Proudhon and Fourier and concluding that yes, indeed, they were right. Fourier had the initial response, that is, he looked back, he hearkened back to the original organization of people and said, what we need are cooperatives, which is what people experienced for millennia before capitalism. And so this spirit of cooperation, which involves a mix of communal property for everybody to use and individual holdings where Buzzanco can raise squash and I can raise corn because that's what we want to do with our own holding, allowed for both individuality and community membership. And we could both make a few bucks on the side by selling our excess corn. But our primary, or squash, our primary focus was subsistence. We're not in it for the money. A few people were, and they weren't anarchists. Usually they moved towards some other mode of organization, including, and I see this as the alarming characteristic in human nature, an attraction for authoritarian rule and dictatorship, or oligarchical capitalism, which is, I think, what we're moving into here in the United States.
I think that's the kind of evolution of capitalism goes toward that kind of
yeah,
oligopolies.
I think so. It looks that way.
More the monopoly capital, you have oligopolistic capital.
So then, you know, the anarchists grew in force because of the desperation. People were moving from the countryside in desperate straits as commercialized agriculture drove them off the land with collaboration of the state, use of force, into big cities, and Paris being one of the first really big cities, a crossroad of trade and commerce, that offered them an alternative outlet, that is, they could find jobs. And as they created these masses of what became urban workers, you had the popularizers of these values in the 19th century, Proudhon and Bakunin, followed by Kropotkin. And they advocated a mix of actions, including ever larger forms of mass organization, what we call unions, and they called syndicates. And for the peasants, they saw the restoration, the formalization of communal contracts for village and rural living. Bakunin, however, witnessing repression on the part of he was a Russian nobleman who saw, you know, the Tsar and the police state that the Tsars created with their Cossacks, advocated violence and retaliation. It started as self-defense, and it probably constituted at the peak about 2% of the movement. But given the value,
it's like the Narodniki emerged out of this, right?
Pardon?
The Narodniki emerged out of this in Russia.
Yeah.
These are the bomb throwers.
Oh, yeah. And the assassin of the Archduke Ferdinand. Right. But they created a mass movement which swept across Latin Europe, because Latin Europe had a stronger sense, I think, of family and of community than the Germans and British.
It's prevalent in Southern Europe and Southern Sicily. Sicily is really the
and Spain.
The home, of course, in Spain.
And you have this tremendous cohesion of southern Spain, for example, and the surroundings of Barcelona. And so the anarchists gained a foothold in Spain and began to organize on a mass scale to where they became the sizable plurality of the working class movement. So they were, gee whiz, maybe 40% of Spain's workers were in anarchist unions, and then you had the communists were down around 18 or 20, and then the socialists were somewhere in between.
Let me go back to two things. I'll get back to that. Two things
but
you mentioned.
You end up with a mass movement by the early 20th century.
I want to just kind of go back for a minute because you mentioned cooperatives and you mentioned syndicalism, because I think there's this kind of myth that anarchy doesn't allow for any kind of large organization or centralized organization, and obviously syndicalism, which is really prevalent. Let's say in the U.S. From the Wobblies, the IWW, they were anarcho-syndicalists.
Yep.
And cooperatives. I mean, this was advocated by groups like the Knights of Labor, socialists like Gene Debs, and others. So within an anarchist framework, you can have these kinds of collective organizations.
Oh, sure.
And they can even be quite large in the case of unions.
Yeah, the privatization program, when the oligarchy took over in Mexico in 1982, they began to roll back the gains of the revolution. The first thing they attacked were the cooperatives that had been created by the Zapatistas and Villistas, and they abolished 1,600 cooperatives during the 80s, forcing people out of these mutual aid arrangements and cooperative planning and production, where they could stay in their original communities, etc., and created the enemy of modern capitalism by forcing them now. 25% of the people of the country live in one city because they had no alternative. With the destruction of the co-ops, they could no longer reinforce one another and survive in the countryside. So that whole mode of social organization fed the movement. And at the same time, as the capitalists grew in power, they refined their repression and intensified it to the point where Bakunin's concept of creative destruction came to the fore and began to lead to the assassinations and the bombing of institutions that were considered anathema, such as the Los Angeles Times.
No, Haymarket. I mean,
Sure.
these guys consider
Haymarket.
themselves anarchists at Haymarket.
Although I'm not entirely sure that the workers committed that crime in Haymarket.
Well, no,
That
actually, it's
particular
more
episode.
likely than not that the actual bomb was thrown by, that's almost certain. The
Well,
bomb was thrown by police agents.
Yeah, I was
provocateurs,
thinking it might have been
No, I think
agents
that's,
provocateurs.
no, Jean Provoc, yeah, I think that's clear. But getting back to you were talking about Spain, which I think is kind of the highlight of kind of anarchic history.
Because
where you
libertarian socialism might have worked in Spain because you already had this voluntary consciousness that was not just the anarchists, but the liberals and the social democrats were willing to accept it. So you're looking at an overwhelming majority. The only people that were not fully incorporated were the Stalinists at that time because they
fascists,
felt,
of course.
because they felt
Yeah.
and the fascists, but on the left, the Stalinists.
No, right.
Because they felt the program would be betrayed later on.
Right.
So,
Well, I think, and in a sense, even though anarchists were vital in the Bolshevik Revolution, you see that tension immediately, where the Soviet system becomes, so kind of rigid
and one of the things
and
that
centralized.
your students may not appreciate because they weren't around then was the similarity between Lenin and
You and I weren't around then either.
Well, yeah, but I mean, we
You
read
remember
about it
Lenin?
because we're professional historians. And when Kropotkin, the leader
Right.
of the movement, died, Lenin let the anarchists that were in jail out to join the other anarchists, and they had this 500,000 person march through Moscow to commemorate Kropotkin with Lenin's endorsement.
Yeah.
So there was a mutual respect
Right.
there, even if they were inalterably opposed already, having experienced armed conflict between the two groups.
In terms of political organization, I mean, I think one of the key element of anarchy, as I see it, is this kind of idea of decentralization.
Yeah.
Taken to its extreme, what you see now is people say, abolish all government, abolish the state, abolish this and that.
Yeah, and this is rooted in the social origins of
Right.
the movement because you go back to those villages, and what they saw as trade grew was the alternative of a federalized system in which the state would only conduct foreign policy and would be comprised of delegates sent by the independent villages. And so what we call states' rights would be reduced to Houston rights. And Houston, Austin, Dallas, San Antonio, and El Paso would send delegates to a state-level convention who would run the government, and those in turn would send delegates to the National Federation, which would have these limited powers, and national defense would be conducted by home-based militias. And so
But you do have some level of
Buzzanco
organization.
and John Hart would not be betrayed by somebody declaring war in Iraq
Right.
against totally innocent victims,
Right.
because we would say, no, we don't want to go. We would control the military right here at home.
But you do have a level of organization at that point.
Yeah,
You do have
it's highly
something
organized.
It's highly organized.
This
right?
is one of the things that they say the absence of government. That's a gross simplification.
Right,
It's got a
right.
lot
That's
of
what I'm
government.
getting at. That's what I'm
And
getting
there are a
at.
lot of controls. This is not all perfect.
Well, in fact, if
because-
you look at the way the Cuban and Vietnamese revolutions were both, structured afterward, that's kind of what you see, like at Cuba.
Oh, sure.
You have people in the workplace who
Yeah.
have, elect representatives, and they go to the next level, and all of these people meet. Now, clearly, the Castro brothers can, make decisions. Absolutely, the Politburo can. But there's some incredible input up there when there was in Vietnam too.
Exactly.
Where
I
it's
was
often at the
reading a
workplace
piece by
level.
Chomsky in which he pointed out that over 70% of Vietnamese agriculture is carried out through cooperatives. but they do have a federal government, so they have.
I don't know if that's still true today.
Yeah, well,
It's
that
so
was
heavily privatized.
That was about 15, 20
Yeah,
years ago.
it's really heavily privatized today.
Uh,
And that's the point. I think, a lot of times, especially in contemporary times, you see this real antagonism between, especially young people who call themselves anarchists and people who call themselves socialists. And
Yeah.
I remember having an event here where a socialist was coming in, and I asked some of the student group to participate. And I said, "Oh, we're anarchists. We won't participate or endorse or even promote an event where a socialist is speaking." And I thought that was incredibly short-sighted and really ahistorical.
Well, one of the things that's happened as the movement has weakened over the years with the rise and development, consolidation of capitalist power, it's become fragmented to the point where we're looking at remnants. And I think the most angry militant people are the ones who still are identifying themselves as anarchists. I gave a speech in Mexico City last fall in which we had to meet in secret in the basement of a building near downtown Mexico City, and 70 people showed up, and they were a wide range of ages, from my age all the way down to teenage people. But they were well-read and they were anarchists. And they then invited me afterwards to a rock concert in which anarchist performers denounced the state through music while they did something similar to slam dancing from the 80s,
Did you dance with them?
No, I didn't dance. I was fearing physical, my mortality was at stake there. But they don't, they appreciate the past, but they don't have the demographic base anymore. When we talk about the 1930s, my God, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of workers that would mobilize, both in Mexico and in Spain, and now that's gone. And so anarchism, I think, is being redefined by the anarchists themselves.
If you were to give advice, let's say, to the contemporary movement, the Occupy Wall Street people today, whether they identify as anarchists or not, what would you tell them?
I think they need to reorganize all these people that are unemployed and that are being displaced and underemployed. We're looking at 15 to 16%, or if you count our adult population, you're probably looking at 30 million workers.
Oh, easily.
And I'm thinking that there's a potential there for organizing people around the issue of human rights, which is the basic essence of anarchism anyway. Going back to those rights that they knew for millennia before capitalism defeated them, really gained the initiative, I would say, as a hegemonic movement in the 18th century.
If you continue to take this view that anarchy obviously is decentralized, if you continue to take this view that it's kind of unstructured or structureless, can you go out and organize these people? I mean, that's one of the real issues, right, with Occupy. There's this kind of a leaderless movement, it's kind of a structureless movement. That's one of the critiques of it.
Yeah.
They won't make demands, they don't have a political program. And the anarchists have programs.
Yeah.
They have clearly defined programs. And if you look at in the U.S. model, I think that the heyday of anarchism and anarchy in the U.S. was in the early 20th century, the World War I era, right before, and then culminating with the Sacramento Vanzetti trial. I think Sacramento Vanzetti are kind of the posters.
One of the things that's a tough question, and I don't have an answer for it. It seems to me one of the preconditions for organizing, and again, I don't fully understand how to go forward with it, is the need to reintroduce industry and to have production around new inventions with a foreclosure of exporting patents, so that the oligarchy cannot export jobs to the third world and demobilize American workers by doing that, which is what they've done. And so in order to reorganize those workers, we have to have workers control or presence in the means of production, and the means of production therefore have to be domestic, with restraints on exporting that productivity to third world producers. And then, with that kind of base, workers can organize effectively and reinstitute, at least for the foreseeable future, something like bilateral work or cooperation like we used to see between the United Auto Workers and GM or Chrysler or Ford. That would be optimistic to see that happen, but to go beyond that toward the anarchist social order or utopia is, it's almost like looking at the ether.
I don't want to take up a whole lot of your time. Is there anything like that you think is essential that I haven't brought up or that you haven't brought up?
No, I think the questions you've asked are really to the issue. Students need to remember, one, that this is an ancient thing that goes back to the human nature itself and not by the capitalist line, the propaganda that is unnatural. It is the basis of the human left, if you will, and it goes all the way back to prehistory. It was an articulation of the values of its time that were inherited from that long history, carried forward into the industrial age through anarcho-syndicalism. And it's still there today because people are still resisting authority, but that's just the first level. Resisting authority is one thing. Organizing to make things better is another. And that's the question that you asked that I can't answer.
No, I don't think any of us have good answers
Yeah.
for it. Thanks so much, John Mason Hart. He's a Morris Professor of History, author of Revolutionary Mexico, which Carlos Fuentes called the best book on the Mexican Revolution, and Empire and Revolution, which has won numerous awards and other works of history. And your first book was what, Anarchism in the Mexican Revolution?
It was called Anarchism and the Mexican Working Class.
The Mexican Working Class. So if you want to learn about anarchy, this is a good place to start, as well as some of the folks who John mentioned. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Bob.
That was painless.